BlackRock are purchasing entire neighborhoods of single-family homes and turning them into rentals.
How many homes does BlackRock really own?
44% of all single-family home purchases in 2023 were by private equity firms, aka BlackRock.
Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with BASEDPolitics, and you're watching Hannah Explains It All, where every week I break down complicated political, social, and economic questions and help you understand what's actually creating the problems that you're dealing with in society. If you like this episode, don't forget to check out others in the series and also subscribe to the channel, leave me a like and a comment. As we all know, housing has become substantially unaffordable in the United States, and actually I did an entire video on this very problem when I first launched this series a few weeks ago. As I discussed then, there are numerous public policy decisions being made that are leading to a shortage in the supply of housing. And if we want things to get better, those are the fundamental obstacles we have to go after if we actually want to ensure that more housing gets built, that it gets done so in an affordable manner, and that therefore people who are looking to buy or rent have more options that are within their budget. But as I mentioned in that episode a few weeks ago, there are a lot of boogeymen when it comes to this problem that people are pointing to and even going after when it comes to legislative goals that aren't really responsible for the cost of housing, but people think they are. And probably the most prominent of these boogeymen of the moment are investing companies like BlackRock.
More importantly, there's three giant corporations, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, which own, collectively, they own each other, so it's really one giant corporation, but they also own 89% of the S&P 500. They own everything. They've now decided to buy every single family home in America. So if they stay on the current trajectory, they will own 60% of the homes in this country, single-family homes, by 2030. They literally are trying to buy everything. And the head of it, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is on the board of the World Economic Forum. And what they've said, we want this great reset, which is you will own nothing and you will be happy. Well,
a lot of people are firmly under the belief that it is because investment companies are buying up all of the real estate that there is a shortage. They are convinced that they are then driving up the prices for rent and for other homes. They think that they're coming in and they're offering cash way above market value, and that's why they can't get into a house affordably. And this gets very conspiratorial very quickly. I often see people when they're talking about BlackRock or Vanguard buying up all the houses saying that you will own nothing and be happy, that this is a global conspiracy meant to ensure that you won't be able to afford basic things that you want, that the American dream is gone. And look, I'm not saying that there is absolutely no truth to that belief system. I do think there is a global agenda, if you will, where many of the global entities like the UN, like the WHO, these are entities that hate capitalism. They absolutely do want to undermine it. They are joined by many of the progressives on the left in the United States in those goals. And I think they are trying to push people into a communist utopia, which of course would be a complete hellhole of a place to live. But just because that's their goal doesn't mean that's what's happening in the housing market as we speak. The good news is America is still largely a capitalist country. Yes, we have many sectors that are overrun with government, making us less and less capitalist as we speak. The government is getting bigger, and these are significant problems. Housing is one of those markets that is becoming overrun with government. And as I pointed out in my initial episode, the government policies are the reasons that we have a shortage of supply when it comes to housing, and therefore why the prices have skyrocketed. But the answer to that is not to attack capitalism or to attack private businesses. The answer is to get rid of the government in place that's making it difficult to create more supply. Because without government in the way, when demand is here, supply will always organically rise to meet it unless something is getting in its way and pushing it down, like bad public policies. A few weeks ago, when I broke down what those public policies in the way are, I pointed out that the data simply does not back up the notion that investment companies are buying up all the real estate or driving up the prices. I asked at that time if people wanted a more comprehensive episode detailing that fact, and I got an overwhelming response from you guys saying that you very much did want to dig into this more. So since this seems to be a very common assumption in society that BlackRock is buying up all the houses and leading to the spike, I'm going to really dig into the day-to-day and make sure you have the tools and information you need to really know what's going on so that you can focus on the true culprits and hopefully be able to compel your lawmakers to make a difference. I want to go to an article I found in The Atlantic, which I actually think is a really great deep dive into the various factors that are at play when it comes to this question. As they point out, the common narrative around housing is, and actually has been for decades, that there is some greedy interest over here and they are buying up all the supply over here, and that is leading to prices going up. The villain that's pointed to in this scenario, or the bad guy, it actually changes decade to decade. At one point, it was Airbnb. Sometimes it's been greedy landlords. Other times it's developers. Now, the current boogeyman of the moment is institutional investors. And as they point out, this kind of narrative is compelling because it doesn't implicate real people, nor does it go after sympathetic institutions, nor does it go after elected officials. But to state the obvious, a story can be compelling without being true. And I think that if you are trying to participate in public policy, which I encourage people to do, it is your duty as an American citizen to be informed and to participate. You have a representative government, so you need to be petitioning them based on things you want to see come out of their legislatures. But in order to do that, you need to be hyper aware of these kinds of scapegoats. And that is scapegoats that are not easy to defend. Things like banks and oil companies and institutional investors, they're not real people. You don't actually picture individuals behind them. And so it's really easy to make them the bad guy. And oftentimes that leads to a big entity being the scapegoat and taking the blame, while the people actually responsible for the real problems we're living with get off scotch-free. Now, I often see this narrative about investment companies like BlackRock being responsible for the housing crisis on platforms like TikTok, maybe from real estate agents, people who are participating in the housing market. But I also see it from members of our own government and other elected officials who, one, should know better, and who, two, have a vested interest in you pointing at somebody else for the problem versus them and their bad policies. And this is not just politicians on the left, by the way, which it wouldn't be that surprising to see going after private business, wealthy investors, corporations. That's kind of the Democrats' whole thing. This is coming from Republicans as well. Now, I will note the Republicans it's coming from are decidedly not capitalist, not limited government supporters, and not people that would in any way be in the same camp ideologically as me. But nationalists like Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio are out here trying to convince people that this narrative is true, along with many progressives and other Democrats. In fact, he said one of the largest hedge funds, the largest Wall Street firms in the world, is going around and buying up every single family home in the country during his Senate campaign in 2020 and 2021. Now, surely you would think somebody who is a graduate of Yale and running for a U.S. Senate seat would have a better understanding of the landscape they are discussing. But alas, that doesn't really seem to be true, not just for J.D. Vance, but for many other politicians as well. In fact, this theory has spawned congressional hearings, legislation, and no shortage of media outrage across right-wing and left-wing sources. Now, in order for this whole theory to be true, you would have to have an investment company own a pretty significant portion of a given area's housing market in order for them to control enough supply to drive housing prices up in the first place. So the question is that happening? Hardly. According to one report, institutional investors accounted for only 3% of home purchases in 2021. So right away, the theory falls apart at the national level. But when you dig into the states, it falls apart even further. Georgia, where I live, actually has a relatively high percentage when it comes to investment purchases of homes, and they topped in at 8.5% in 2021. Now, there are many areas you can live in Georgia, of course, but I live in Atlanta, and cities do tend to be at the upper end of the price scale when you look at a given region, simply because you're trying to pack more people into a smaller area than you would be in, say, Albany, Georgia. And despite the fact that Georgia has the highest percentage of investor purchases on the books, it is still vastly cheaper to live in Atlanta, Georgia than it is almost any other major city I can think of in the United States. Housing prices are far less here than they are in places like Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, even Dallas or Houston. And while Georgia comes in at the highest of 8.5% in 2021 for investor purchases, the average was more about 2 to 3% in most areas. In fact, even in popular destinations like Oregon, which has a lot of tourist traffic and would be very appealing to institutional investors, it only saw 2% of purchases go to institutional investors. On top of that, 2 to 8% of purchases in a given year does not mean that that investment company owns 2 to 8% of the housing market in that region. You have to remember that most homes are not even up for sale year to year. And on top of that, a purchase does not mean a permanent holding. Many investors will buy a home, fix it up, and then sell it. But despite these factors being true, home prices have shot up across the country. So in order to figure out what's going on, you have to look at what a common denominator is that could be impacting all of these regions despite their differences at the same time. Referring back to that article from The Atlantic, from August 2020 to August 2021, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Montana, and Idaho saw the most significant home price increases, but of those states, just the first two, Nevada and Arizona, saw relatively high rates of mega investors. The 2021 data shows that Arizona saw the highest at roughly 8.9% of homes on the market going to mega investors. So to summarize before I move on, housing prices have gone up and are continuing to go up across the country despite the fact that most states are seeing very few investment purchases of their homes, and even in the states that are seeing an influx of that, it's well beneath 10% of the market share. So it makes absolutely no sense to blame this as the central component for why housing prices are becoming more expensive. Now, I want to turn my attention back to the politicians that are trying to drive this narrative because, as I mentioned, they have a vested interest in blaming anything but themselves for this reality that Americans are living with. In order to stay in office, they have to convince the majority of people that their ideas are good, they're doing a good job of implementing them, and they're working, or at the very least, that they're going after the bad guys that are harming people. That makes fighting institutional investors a very good distraction for them because what they actually need to be doing in order to bring down the price of housing is politically more difficult. It would mean actually standing up to a lot of people who don't want to see things like zoning laws overturned. People who are adamant that we keep historical overlays so that old and efficient buildings can remain when really we need to build better, more efficient buildings in those spaces. More importantly, though, it would mean they'd actually have to get rid of a lot of government. They need to get rid of many of the ridiculous inspections and requirements that are on the books to build right now, and that would mean getting rid of a lot of government positions. Because taxpayer-funded lobbying is allowed in this country, a lot of those government positions spend a lot of money lobbying politicians in order to keep their jobs and stay relevant. It's basically one large circle jerk where all of these people are getting something for this whole scam that you're living with, and so there's little incentive for them to come in and meaningfully fix it. And this kind of stuff runs deep, guys. It's not just individual politicians that are trying to point to investment companies to get off the hook. These are whole committees that are looking into this when they have to know this isn't really going on. I want to point you to a report from the House Financial Services Committee that reads, in the third quarter of 2021 alone, institutional investors bought 42.8% of homes for sale in the Atlanta metro area and 38.8% of homes in the Phoenix, Glendale, Scottsdale area. That's astounding and very different from the numbers I found. Why would that be, I wonder? The Atlantic points out these are unbelievably big numbers, and they are literally unbelievable, that is. The citation provided in the document was not correct, but they were able to find the relevant report, and wouldn't you know it, that's not what it says. The report shows only the share of purchases made by investors, not institutional investors. Why does this matter? Because investors include people or entities who own fewer than 10 properties, mid-size investors who own 10 to 99 homes, iBuyers, which buy properties and then immediately resell them, and even people who purchase vacation homes through an LLC. Relatedly, a New America report last year of investor activity in North Carolina suggested that investor growth in that market is actually being driven by smaller players. But the House Financial Services Committee is by no means the only entity within government trying to mislead people on this fact. At an event on the rise of institutional investors, Marcia Fudge, the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, better known as HUD, noted that in Cleveland's eastern inner ring suburbs, investors have purchased nearly one-third of homes every year since 2015. While this is not as blatant as the House Committee report because Fudge was careful to say merely investors, given the context of her remarks being given at an event titled Institutional Investors in Housing, the implication was that private equity firms or hedge funds were taking over Cleveland. It's worth pointing out here that if a wide array of investors, particularly different types of investors, are the ones actually buying the houses, it's very, very unlikely that any single entity is therefore driving up the prices of the housing market. Now, you could say that they are limiting the supply within the housing market and that is driving up the prices. And I think that's a more fair and intellectually honest argument than everything else I've presented here so far. But as mentioned, many of these groups are not holding on to these properties long term. All of this is very similar to a prior boogeyman when it comes to housing prices we saw a couple years ago, which was Zillow and Redfin. People were saying these kinds of websites were buying up all of the housing supply, and they were buying up a lot of houses. But not there long after, Zillow actually turned around and exited the market on that front. And they even did so at a loss on many of their properties. So all of this to say, the people who are telling you this narrative are being disingenuous, and that should make you question why, which I think I've explained pretty well today. But just in case you didn't get it, it's because they're the ones that are actually responsible and they don't want to do anything about the true culprits. Now, in 2020 and 2021, when the housing market was crazy hot and interest rates were rock bottom low, we did see a rush on houses where a lot of people were not only paying cash, but even offering $10, $20, $30, $40, $50, $60, $70,000 over. It was crazy. People were getting outbid left and right. So I do understand why many people who were trying to get a house during that time period had the perception that very powerful corporations had to be behind that phenomenon. But research by The Atlantic also pokes holes in that theory. They say although all cash offers are certainly on the rise, many of these bids were from wealthy people, house flippers, or smaller landlords. And one survey of realtors found an average 0% difference in offer price of institutional buyers compared to other buyers. In 2021, according to a recent report, the median purchase price of institutional buyers was typically 26% lower than the state's median purchase price, suggesting that they are not typically competing with ordinary individual buyers anyways. Institutional investors tend to specialize in distressed communities. In these markets, they can take advantage of economies of scale in making repairs. And that makes the most sense. If a market is capped, if the house is actually already being priced above what it really should be because of inflation and because of interest rates, that's not really a smart investment for these companies to be making. What's a good investment for them to be making are areas that have not gentrified yet, where they can come in and buy housing very cheaply, they can afford to take on the risk, they can afford to renovate those properties, and then they can turn them for a profit. That's not necessarily a bad thing because they are therefore improving the quality of the houses that are on the market in the first place. But all in all, when you look at what's happening in the market, investors are not creating unaffordability in housing, but they are responding to it. I'll repeat this ad nauseum, but housing is expensive because there is a shortage of supply. That is causing prices to skyrocket, and that is causing investors to follow the money and get involved in this sector. In fact, one institutional investor's SEC filing admitted just that. He said they were celebrating a, quote, decline in supply that has driven strong rental rate growth and home price appreciation. The filing also lamented the possibility that, quote, continuing development will increase the supply of housing and exacerbate competition for residents. I love this paragraph from The Atlantic where they say private equity isn't the first villain and it likely won't be the last to be cast in the role of the housing scapegoat. Airbnb, foreign buyers, greedy developers, all of these groups have taken center stage and probably will again. Nobody needs to defend these entities, but playing whack-a-mole with the villain of the moment won't increase the amount of affordable housing we build. It won't untangle the uncomfortable matrix of interests that oppress change and growth and opportunities for first-time homebuyers, and it won't satisfy the growing anger of the tens of millions of Americans spending more than 30% of their incomes on housing. And they are absolutely right. At the end of the day, all of this is merely a distraction. And if you buy into it, they are going to keep you chasing the wrong priorities and nothing will get better. I want to point you to one last study I found at Reason Magazine on this issue that I thought was particularly interesting. They reported that a team of Dutch researchers affiliated with the University of Amsterdam released a study on the effects of a new law letting municipalities in the Netherlands ban buy-to-let arrangements. In Rotterdam, the country's second largest city, officials used the new law to ban investors from purchasing homes in specific neighborhoods. What were the effects of that, you might ask? And I'm glad you did. Let me answer. They say that allowed researchers to compare home sales, home prices, and the characteristics of new residents between the two types of neighborhoods. And they found that banning investors from buying and converting housing to rentals worked in one sense. The share of investor-owned rental properties in affected neighborhoods fell, and the number of properties bought by first-time homebuyers increased. On the other hand, however, these new homeowners tended to be richer than the renters they were replacing, and the cost of rental housing increased overall. The ban has successfully increased middle-income households' access to homeownership at the expense of buy-to-let investors. Renters. However, the policy also drove up rents in affected neighborhoods, thereby damaging housing affordability for individuals reliant on private rental housing, undermining some of the intentions of the law, write researchers in the study published on SSRN. The number of homes sold and overall home prices also stayed flat, according to the study. This cuts against common arguments against investor-owned rental housing that is raising prices for everyone. So all this really proves is that banning investors from participating in the market merely means that renters have fewer options. And to be clear, there are a lot of renters in the United States who could not qualify for mortgages no matter what housing prices were. Their credit's not good enough, they don't have stable income, there are a lot of things that go into qualifying you for a mortgage. Housing affordability is one of those things, but according to a report I read, over 80% of current renters would not qualify for a mortgage no matter what. So what you would actually be doing if you tried to ban companies like BlackRock from buying houses is ensuring that people have fewer options when it comes to rent, probably less nice options because they wouldn't be renovating them for a profit, and therefore lower income people would get pushed further and further out of cities, often where they need to be to work. And you would be doing all of that for roughly 2 to 8% of the housing market in a given year, and no indication that any of this would actually lead to the price of housing coming down. So what I say is let's focus on the actual public policies that need to change and quit worrying about what these companies are doing. All right, guys, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts or questions on this material. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And other than that, I'll see you next week. If you like this episode, don't forget to check out others in the series. Hannah Explains It All here. And you can watch my weekly show, the BASEDPolitics podcast, here.